Battlefield fans are very upset that there was a plucky lady cyborg in the trailer for V for Victory, and in their opinion that betrays the pretense to realism of the game's allegedly historically accurate World War II setting. This is the basis of an unbridled rage fire that's been burning unabated around the game for, hold on, let me check it. 5 months? Guys, Jesus Christ. Now, I'm 37 years old, which in online gamer internet personality years practically makes me Steve Rogers without the magic blue immortality steroids, so this is clearly going to be one of those areas where I'm just out of step with where games culture is in modernity. I came of age in the era of gaming where sort of punk rock looking lady cyborg in World War II, by the way, yes, I know she's not a cyborg because prosthetic limbs have existed for centuries of human history, but you'd be surprised how many people aren't doing a shtick when they call it that. Anyway, she would have fit right in with fire-breathing Russian circus strongman dinosaur fighter, princess rescuing turtle-stomping Italian plumber from Brooklyn, Greek disco demigod with flaming yo-yo, whatever the hell was going on here. You get the idea. In the 16-bit days, you demanded your money back if they didn't offer you at least one Trinity-looking action girl with a robot arm. I tell you what. Hell, when Capcom did the Alien vs. Predator arcade game, they were like, yeah, we know people are gonna want to play as the Predator and maybe Schwarzenegger, but we're gonna give him power armor anyway, just to be sure, and throw in a lady soldier ninja just because. And then they decided they liked her enough, she became part of the Street Fighter canon, meaning Predators, Xenomorphs, and Cyborg Dutch are part of the Street Fighter canon too. How about that? But okay, lady in video game, men on internet angry, rest of world point and laugh, film at 11. Now look, for a change, I'm gonna go against my first instincts here and take on face value that at least a portion of the suspension of disbelief complaints are sincere and not just cover for sad internet man-baby misogyny. Not necessarily because I'm convinced that it is, but there's a more interesting discussion to be had if I do. See, whenever the that's not realistic argument crops up in games like this, or Call of Duty, or Assassin's Creed, or Total War? Can't you make Rome not fall in Total War? So we're not really talking, oh, whatever. There's a tendency to dunk on the fanboys by pointing out that all of the other dumb physics, logic-defying things you can do in these games because they are in fact video games. And yeah, that's funny, but it also leads to people arguing past each other instead of actually engaging in any meaningful way. Yes, all representations and recreations of historic periods and events in art and fiction are to varying degrees unrealistic because they are in fact unreal. Even the most studiously researched and painstakingly crafted version thereof is at best an interpretation of reality, an expression, an abstraction even, always in some way informed by the portion of reality it opts to focus on, the data available at the time, the cultural perspective of the storyteller and the visualizer, and the generally culturally accepted shared vision of what history in question is supposed to mean and represent. Even the word realism, when used relative to art, is typically not meant to describe accuracy, but illusion thereof, like the use of color and shading to make two-dimensional paintings appear three-dimensional. Saving Private Ryan created what was called the most realistic feeling World War II movie atmosphere ever at that point by using desaturated cinematography to create the optical psychological illusion of a happy medium between our conscious understanding that the real world was in color and the subconscious cultural memory of most audiences vis-a-vis what that war looked like being black and white photographs. For one famous example of the same applied not only to visuals but to general aesthetic, which of course was then ported into video games through the Medal of Honor series produced by Steven Spielberg. To cut to the chase, yes, when an angry man on the internet says I'm mad at Battlefield because the cyborg lady breaks my immersion by being unrealistic, and someone else goes, well actually she's not unrealistic because there's no reason such a person couldn't have fought at the war at the time and several instances are known, etc, etc. Okay, great, but you're spinning your wheels. Because that's not really what the angry dude has got a bug up his ass about. He's not really saying he's doubling down on accuracy. What he's saying is, I was hoping to play a game grounded in the aesthetics of what the reality of World War II had been presented as in history books and films for much of the late 20th century. This features intrusions by more recent revisions of what that reality probably looked like, and that's not what I came for. And there's not, and I'm going to parse this very carefully, very, very carefully, innately anything wrong with that, necessarily. I mean, there's almost always a lot wrong with it right after, because it almost never stays there and instead morphs into much uglier clarifications like, what I mean is, I don't want to see black soldiers or woman soldiers, and I don't care what history has to say about that, because modern cultural Marxist academics are probably just making that shit up anyway. Sure, yes, granted, but conceptually in and of itself, preferring the retrograde conception of something is not necessarily damning. Just, you know, most of the time it ends up there because one thing tends to follow another. Now, to use a personal example, I'm one of those guys who as a kid was really big into dinosaurs, and I'll watch any movie or play any game with dinosaurs in it at least once, but when I do, I prefer they design them to look like the projections of what dinosaurs looked like when I was a kid, as opposed to what they think they do now, which leans more toward the big fluffy bird direction and not so the giant cool lizard monster direction. And I know that's silly and unscientific, I just like them better the way they used to draw them. That doesn't mean I'm quasi-creationist about it or deny the current science, it's just, Given the choice in fictional dinosaur entertainment, that's where I tend to land. What I'm saying is, sometimes as a preference is just a preference for an aesthetic, for a subject matter, whatever. Sure, sometimes it can be tied to an issue or an identity or some broader context, positive or negative, but not always. And when it's not, you don't need to have to go reaching for it. I get why some people feel that they need to. They see this or that cause getting listened to when they complain about a dislike in a game, and they think, oh, if I frame my hang-up about Battlefield as some kind of big deal issue, I can get attention too. But not every hang-up is a big issue, or at the very least, they aren't all created equal. I don't like the graphics in Mega Man 11. It's generic. It looks like 100 other fucking modern 2D side-scrollers. I wish they'd either stuck with the 8-bit NES recreation or went with something radically different, but I'm not going to call myself like a pixel art preservationist or a Capcom fundamentalist or something to make that point. Why would I need to? I'm not into this style is the beginning and end of it. It doesn't have a deeper context, and I honestly don't think most of the knee-jerk rejections of this kind of character mod being an optional part of a World War II game actually have a deeper context either, at least not authentically at first blush. Battlefield going back to World War II had me hoping for something in the tone and texture of Where Eagles Dare or Rat Patrol, and this kind of character design feels kinda now, sensibility-wise, and it takes me out of the headspace I want to be in, is a simple, understandable, and even, again, presented in isolation, reasonable take, sort of. Why would you need to blow it out into the puffed-up absurdity of, this is an affront to history perpetrated by rainbow-washing SJWs? Why does they went a certain direction with the art designs, I'd have preferred a different direction, have to jump the guardrail into, it's a postmodernist soy conspiracy by the globalist cabal to degrade the historic accomplishments of Western achievement? I mean, I don't get it. Well, okay, that's not true. I do get it. I just don't get who you think you're fooling. Now, there's several whole other angles to this, but that's for another time and another show. I don't want to bore everybody. For now, let me leave you with this. As appealing as Righteous Fury in the sense of individual likes or dislikes being part of a bigger picture can be, do you not see how absurd you look? How badly the core of your own arguments are hurt by these kinds of tangential tangents? Does it not register that you're only making it less likely anyone is going to want to make the game that looks or feels the way you'd prefer if this is the attitude they think it supports? And even if you are given to suspect that game development decision-making in 2018 is endlessly besieged by the boogie woman of the shrill, shrieking SJW Harrod and Harpy, what good does it do for your behavior to mirror that? Look, even Freud had to concede that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and in much the same way that many gamers, myself included, have cautioned culture watchers to acknowledge the distinction that not every sexy drawing is a deliberate affront to female autonomy, not every protagonist with a gun is stumping for the NRA, and Mario was never trying to sell you raccoon pelts regardless of what you may have heard from PETA, remember that shit show? Gamers who are so unnerved by this scenario should likewise acknowledge that not every anachronistic according to you design decision in a Battlefield game is a bucket of rainbow paint being thrown on the historic monument of your choosing. Just a thought. And also, is rainbow paint really the worst thing that could be thrown at something? Okay, so we're back from E3. Let's do a show about politics. Okay, so the thing about gaming and its aversion to the very idea of the concept, nay, the very word politics, that's gonna get annoying, is that it's a really broad general term in the real world, and even more so in this ridiculous paradigm of ours. See, people, especially today, tend to think of politics, seriously, as referring only to the that of the government and or law, and even then only to the parts they personally deem arcane, annoying, or unnecessary. Now, there's some etymological truth to at least the first part of that, because it derives from the Greek phrases referring to the management of cities, but in long-term usage, it's largely come to refer to the understanding and maneuvering of assumed and or agreed-upon power structures and rules within a given sphere, be that sphere government, workplace, family, friendship, athletic team, romantic relationship, military unit, whatever. Thusly, every situation has a politics, and thus it is in fact accurate to say that everything is political. Well, that seems kind of arbitrary. So while it's true that my favorite snarky comeback to gamers who insist that they don't want gaming to be the P word, i.e. pointing out that a gaming free of all political themes would mean saying goodbye to all games about crime, war, history, court cases, etc., along with disappearing beloved icons who are themselves literally politicians and or military and law enforcement professionals like Princess Peach, Mayor Mike Hagar, Colonel Guile, pretty much everyone from Dynasty Warriors, most of the cast of Metal Gear, Resident Evil, Phoenix Wright, a bunch of the Final Fantasy people, you get the idea. But it's also much more directly and non-snarkishly true that even without those specific cases, gaming is an innately political medium because all games involve the navigation of systems within a defined sphere, and thus all games have their own technical and textual along with thematic politics. Still, really. And in the biggest irony of all, gaming culture being a sphere unto itself means that the relationship between gamers and their games, each other, the gaming press, and the games industry is also a you-know-what of its own. Several of them at once, in fact. In other words, the dumbest thing about holding the position that strongly defined political beliefs oughtn't be expressed in the gaming sphere is itself an expression of a strongly defined political belief in the gaming sphere. That said, I am grudgingly sympathetic to the sentiment of feeling yanked out of the gaming experience by a ham-fisted, overly blunt message being preached, or just disliking the tacky pretense of shoving some extra big thought into a simple narrative to show off how well-intentioned a creator you are, even though I recognize that when I use that description, I'm generally talking about pretentious, masturbatory, hipster pablum like Night in the Woods, whereas for a lot of other folks, it's just cover for I don't want a game to challenge anything but my thumb speed, and also diversity is an SJW globalist conspiracy. That is, of course, dumb as hell, but what's dumber is that the most consistent example of the politic of gaming trying to perform at being non-political when the subject matter has never been obviously more so, as is the case with Ubisoft. See, Ubisoft likes to make big games with richly detailed, highly explorable worlds and, at least hypothetically, colorful, memorable characters, often drawing from real-world history and current topical events in ways that draw immediate eyebrow-raising attention to the themes and ideas that appear to be set to be addressed, particularly when those themes and ideas might be currently topical or even political. See, Ubisoft loves to traffic in these edgy, button-pushing visuals because it's a good way to get attention, and visual references to even the vague swirl of images about certain current events can trigger, in the conventional sense, a strong "this is important" response in the way we process information. Not just specific stuff like when the Assassin's Creed games put the action in famous historical settings and say, hey, this one is about the American Revolution or whatever, but more general coded signifiers like how you knew Far Cry 5's marketing was evoking white nationalist militia terrorism for its villains even though they weren't technically that, or how Watch Dogs Legion is obviously about fears of a worst-case scenario fallout from the Brexit debacle, even if that doesn't necessarily come up in the game's actual storyline. But according to Ubisoft's VP of editorial, having political themes and aesthetics is not necessarily the same as having a political sensibility or point of view, saying in a blog post, "Our goal is to give the players all the information we can, and then let them choose which side of our game worlds they want to explore. We want them to decide what they like, what they don't like, and if and how to change their minds or the way they play based on that information. It's about more freedom for the players." Which is of course great because it's both specifically bad, dumb games industry logic and yet also instantly recognizable as a strain of generic tech industry bro libertarian bubblethink stupidity that you can only possibly think sounds workable or smart if you almost never interact with other human beings, but it's also frustrating because it also sounds exactly stupid but well-intentioned enough to possibly make it difficult to explain why trying to do games that are obviously about, well,
you that never done nothing.
Our capital is falling.
You put a gun in my hand.
Our leaders are dead or missing.
From my eyes. Anytime.
Dark forces are moving to take control of our nation.
Religious outcasts and depraved fascists prey on the weak and murder the innocent.
All that, but yet also somehow not, is a losing proposition and will only make the games worse. Fortunately, Ubisoft was nice enough to do it for me by making it the entire premise of their new Watch Dogs game.
Ah, London. Had a good run there for a while. Now it's all riots, bombings, and people thrown in cages like animals. Oh, and who could forget the killer robots everywhere?
So yeah, in Watch Dogs Legion, something unspecifically not good has happened in the United Kingdom, and now a fascist government has seized control using the dark side of ubiquitous communications technology, which you must battle as an army of heroic hackers using the good side of ubiquitous communications technology, and also just, guns and punching apparently still seems to work just fine too. Anyway, the big gimmick is that your hacker army is basically Antifa by way of Uber, so you're using an app to recruit and manage your army of anti-government sleeper agents from anyone. Like literally any random NPC in the open world game can be potentially brought on board. Cool mechanic. Really dumb for the narrative of a game, though, that's otherwise trying to wear the skin of a quasi-realistic topical thriller by draping itself in newsworthy imagery, buzzwords, and aesthetics of modern, present-day, politics. I mean, think about it. If you can recruit anyone for a take down the government mission, that means everyone, like in the country, is already more or less in the same ideological page and one phone call from you away from organized violent rebellion. In which case, where did the fascist government come from? Like, it doesn't appear that this version of England was conquered by an enemy nation or space aliens or something. It doesn't look like there was an apocalyptic war or whatever. The things are running, they're just being run by bad guys. So presumably whoever is in charge of this was at one point agreeable enough to some of the population to get installed as the government, and even in the most extreme scenarios, some of the population would probably still support them. It only makes sense, right? I mean, even Hitler was elected. Vladimir Putin technically gets elected every time. The nutcase running Brazil right now was elected. The dictatorial regimes in charge of Cuba and North Korea originally took over as the head of popular revolutions. Fascist, authoritarian, whatever governments of the type being referenced in Legion's topically trope-laden imagery don't just appear out of nowhere and take over places where no one supports them. It doesn't work that way. They generally have followers, supporters, brown shirts, if you like, of their own among the citizenry. That gets them there in the first place. Hell, even the goddamn Star Wars prequels understood this.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Plus, you'd think it would only make a game like this more challenging and interesting if you actually had to work out who among the people you could actually trust to bring into the fold versus, nah, I'm actually okay with fascism and now I'm going to report you. Or, I don't love fascism, but it's not personally kicking my ass right now, and I really can't skip work. That would be more interesting, but it would also require the game to both give the evil government characters and the hacker protagonist a defined ideological divide, aka political outlook to be in conflict over, apart from being evil and not being evil, which, to be fair, as the game is closer to release, they may in fact have, and that might mean actually committing to something like a viewpoint and asking players to at least temporarily imagine themselves doing the same. And Ubi has already apparently made it clear they just aren't interested in planting those kind of ideological flags. And I'm sorry, but for all the highfalutin rhetoric about player choice, it's hard not to read that as just simple cowardice, a company trembling in misplaced fear of the vocal minority of internet trolls who raise holy hell if some remotely progressive idea is evinced in a gaming space, which one imagines it would be in a game about fighting fascism that actually meant it. But even leaving that aside, how is that not just bad design from a narrative standpoint? Yeah, great, every NPC has their own story for when you recruit them, but does that matter when I don't really know what anyone in this revolution would actually be revolting about? Just a thought. A recent article by Simon Parkin of The New Yorker gave some attention to Tom Clancy's The Division 2, because I guess somebody had to, focusing on the absurdity of Ubisoft having to apologize for making a tasteless joke about the game, and then double absurdity of then clarifying that they believe the problem they needed to clarify was not that the joke was in bad taste, but that it implied there was something, anything, remotely political to be read into their game about heavily armed paramilitary fighters battling for resources in the ruins of plague-blighted Washington, D.C.
With the country slipping into civil war.
But the fight to save our nation from total collapse is far from over.
Get down! Everybody get down!
Roving packs of hyenas, religious outcasts, and depraved fascists prey on the weak and murder the innocent. It's time we kick our enemies out of their castles.
This is our defining moment. Our chance to take back our country.
Of course, if you're involved in gaming in any depth, this is where your eyes glaze over because you immediately understand that this is just the way things are and that there's no politics in our military shooter, of course not, is just game companies speak for, of course there are politics in it, we're not stupid, there's machine guns and a burned out White House and American flags everywhere, but we have to say there's not because if we don't, all the worst people on the internet will cluster together like a big ball from the end of Critters 2 and try to smash our Metacritic rating, and we've let AAA gaming creatively stagnate to the point that the audience is narrow and fickle enough for that to actually be a make-or-break problem for us. Now, the counter-argument to that, of course, is that setting a game in and around stuff that has inescapable political connections like government buildings, national flags, guns, law enforcement, any kind of military, is different from a game that actually spells out a specific message, i.e. the Mario Brothers are plumbers, but those games aren't about plumbing, which is true, but if asked, would you say those games are pro or anti regarding plumbers, or Italian Americans for that matter? Or how do you think the Sonic the Hedgehog games feel about animal testing? See, message and narrative is kind of like a smell. Just because you didn't mean for it to be there or not notice that it's there doesn't mean it's not there. Of course, we don't want politics in games. It's never really what anyone who says that is actually saying, and not just because politics is more of a description of action or methodology than a setting or a premise. It's not like saying don't put any baseball in a game, for example. Any game with a system of rules that it's governed by could be said to have a politics to it, and any game narrative featuring any system of government has at least a nominal political dimension to its themes. I mean, all of these characters are technically politicians and or holders of political office. The entire plot of Bad Dudes even was which presupposes that the President of the United States is a good guy who should not be kidnapped by ninjas, which has never been at any point in time a politically neutral statement. And it's not like this is a new conversation for video games. It happens all the time, and it used to happen more frequently and more interestingly back before you could fact-check every little thing on the internet. Old-timers like myself, or fans of the classics who picked up the SNK 40th anniversary set, which you should absolutely do, amazing collection and some of the best curation I've ever seen in this medium, may recall a multi-directional overhead shooter called Guerrilla War, which was basically a sidequel to the Ikari Warrior series, but with the added challenge of a rescue but don't shoot the hostages mechanic and an aesthetic that was more period tropical than G.I. Joe Rambo inspired, setting up the players as revolutionaries overthrowing an island nation's dictatorship in a scenario that vaguely alluded to various real-life revolutionary images familiar from recent history in Latin America at the time. Well, funny story. Originally, there was no vaguely about it. The original Japanese version of the game was called Guevara, as in Ernesto Che Guevara, and it was intended in a very loose sense as a gamified depiction of the overthrow of the Batista Cuban government by communist guerrillas during the 1950s Cuban Revolution. Not only was the Player 1 avatar explicitly meant to depict Guevara himself, Player 2 took on the role of Fidel Castro. Yes, really, and it wasn't intended as any sort of incendiary, ironic, or edgy sort of fashion. If you've played it as Guerrilla War, Guevara is otherwise the same game. Scrappy freedom fighters, mowing down waves of bad guys, rescuing good guys, defeating the bad guy leader and liberating the island. Viva la revolution. Yeah, so this is not a long enough show to properly parse the immensely complicated politics of Che Guevara's life and the multiple different sides, causes, ideologies he was at one point or another associated with. Suffice to say, while there's certainly always been an audience for Che as hero narrative, there has also just as long been a not at all insubstantial swath of people across racial, political, cultural, etc. lines who consider him to be a murderer, butcher, terrorist, war criminal, what have you. For whatever it's worth, I tend to be kind of cynical about revolutionaries. For my estimation, the real heroes of anything like that tend to be the people whose names you don't remember, not the guys whose face winds up on posters in frat boys' dorm rooms, but that's a different show. Either way, the game was obviously unreleasable in the United States and several other places in the world without its title, graphics, and narrative being reworked into the generic guerrilla war, given that Cuba and Castro were considered an enemy nation and, whole communities of Cuban-American refugee immigrants would have likely taken huge offense to a video game about how awesome Guevara supposedly was, which came as a surprise to the Japanese developers because they didn't really know they'd been making a political game and hadn't set out to do so. The director, Koji Ibata, had been developing it as a police-themed shooter, but the head of the company was a big fan of military vehicles and tactics. That's mainly why SNK kept making games about tanks and helicopters back then. And he'd apparently been reading a book about Guevara's military and warfighting tactics as a guerrilla and decided that would be a better setting, so the game became Guevara. But this being the pre-internet era and the political and cultural situation in Japan being mostly disconnected from any issues relating to Cuba or Latin American socialist uprisings, most of the developers had never heard of Che Guevara and couldn't find more than basic boilerplate school history blurbs about the events of the Cuban Revolution, so they kind of fudged it the same way they would a movie game they only had a synopsis and poster to work from at the time. But whether they meant it or not, anyone who did have any tacit connection to the issues would tell you straight off that a game where you play as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro as the heroes is just about one of the most politically charged things you could release, whatever you think of the concept itself. In other words, trying to keep video games free of politics is like trying to keep them free of narrative or conflict even. You can try, and maybe you'll find a version of something where you and your immediate circle of friends can all stand around and be able to sniff the air and say, nope, just air here. But sooner or later, I guarantee you someone is gonna smell something. And when they do, games industry, shouldn't it at least smell good? Just a thought.